if a kid's having a tantrum, it's about listening to what they're having a tantrum about. I mean, obviously, you kind of still have to be firm. There's nothing wrong with being firm in a gentle way and setting a boundary with a child, because all children need boundaries. They change. Those boundaries change as they grow, type thing. But all children need boundaries. When they don't have boundaries, then it's not. They don't like it. It can be dysregulating. They don't know where they stand, etc. But as I say, those boundaries change as children get older. So if a child's throwing a tantrum, then you don't want that child to be picking up things and throwing objects or etc. Whatever they're doing, kicking, biting, whatever. You can't. So you have to be kind of clear about that's not okay, obviously. But I say but it's not to. In my book, it's not to push down the feeling. The idea is to be with the feeling the child's experiencing. So if the child's frustrated, angry, what's the child frustrated, angry about? And so for me, it's about having a conversation or trying to understand the child's point of view and seeing if you can address that, because then the child feels heard.
Welcome to the Emil Varna podcast. Today you'll be learning all about things like somatic experiencing, Gestalt therapy, psychotherapies of different strains, and basically all things body related in terms of stress, trauma, anxiety, and when you're feeling a bit triggered. I interviewed Rob Watson, who is a clinician within the mental health sectors as well as in private practice. His work to support people from homelessness, addiction, as well as self-development and improvement from a spiritual and a body-based point of view. He's got an incredible passion towards the spiritual elements of psychotherapy, as well as finding ways to integrate the body with healing. We talk about things like the nervous system response to threat, how different brain structures come together and assess and orient towards a particular threat and stress and trauma and anxiety and all that sort of stuff. So if you're interested in taking charge of your own nervous system and figuring out ways to become a better version of you and hopefully kind of get a grip on your own traumas and stresses, this episode is just for you. Sit back, relax, or strap on some earphones, go for a run, do your thing, and we'll be heading right on into it. Hello, Rob. Thank you for coming to the Emil Varna podcast. It's good to have you on board today. For those who might not know you or know the type of work that you do, can you give us a little bit of a background on what it is you're all about?
Sure. Thanks, Emil. Thanks for asking me to do this interview. It's an interesting process. Yeah, it's cool. Bit about me. So I sort of do two things. I sort of work in community services in a drug and alcohol program, and I also do private practice. I do that in two places, sort of in Melbourne, in Northcote, and in Ringwood. So yeah.
And what kind of work do you do when it comes to private practice? What's your capacity?
I suppose the type of work I do, I'm a Gestalt therapist. That was my first primary training. And then recently I've done somatic experiencing. So I sort of blend those two methodologies together. So there's sort of an integrated approach I try to do. But I also have, a spiritual orientation, a transpersonal orientation to my work as well, because I'm highly influenced by the diamond approach. But from that approach only kind of comes into the work if the person I'm seeing has that inclination. But primarily, it's more of a Gestalt and somatic experiencing approach. Yeah.
I want to pick your brain on that, but we'll get to that very soon. Can you define what approach is that?
The somatic experiencing?
No, not the somatic experiencing, the more spiritual inclination. Can you just work on definitions and then we'll come back to them after?
Okay, fair enough. Well, I suppose my own personal journey, I guess that's what it's heavily influenced by, and that's an ongoing thing. I've been involved with the diamond approach for about 13. I think I'm in my 14th year now. So that's an inquiry-based approach, but it's also from this perspective, the diamond approach perspective, it's more it's actually acknowledging that our psychological experience and the way we relate to the world is also a doorway to deeper aspects of ourselves. And so, and they see that how we get psychologically identified in the way we are in the world, it can also be a barrier. So the idea is that you're looking at trying to be more open and exploring the deeper, sort of more unconscious, out of awareness patterns that govern our lives. That more, I guess, it's heavily influenced by psychoanalysis. It's got a lot of history and some of the early developmental psychologists.
All right, and that's called the diamond approach. Is that correct?
Diamond approach, yeah. It's sort of it's a Western perspective. The founders live in the States. There's one guy called Hamid Ali and Karen Johnson. They founded Diamond approach back in, well, I don't know, I think it was the late 70s, 80s. And it's very much, even though it's got influences from the Eastern contemplative traditions, it's also draws heavily from a lot of psychological theory and methods. And sort of, it's kind of a blended approach. And I think that's probably why I like it, because it's got this Western orientation, a Western view with Western wisdom. And I guess it also, because I've got obviously a passion in psychotherapy and counselling, I had a natural inclination to move towards that as well. It was like, for me, it was like a marriage between, I had this spiritual orientation in my meditation and mindfulness practices that I do, which is also comes into the therapy that I provide, and then also my psychological sort of interests and passions. And when I started first reading about the Diamond approach, it was kind of like, it was a Yahoo moment where they were able to sort of merge the two together.
It's so interesting. It comes to mind. There's a clinical psychologist from Canada called Jordan Peterson, and he talks about integration between spiritual and psychological elements as well. But I've never heard of the diamond approach.
Yeah, I mean, they would say, say it was a spiritual. It's not. They would say it was a spiritual path versus a psychological path. But when you look at it, and my own experience, the processes seem quite psychological. But yeah, I agree with them. I think most people have some sort of, in our belief systems, whether you have a religious orientation or a spiritual orientation, that it's sort of undervalued on some level in most psychological fields and counselling fields. And yet a lot of people have that orientation to the world and how they relate to the world from a deeper point of view. And to sort of not include it in the therapy process, sometimes it can be limiting. Not for everybody, of course. It's a case by case situation, and it's not something I sort of personally, push into the therapy process. It's wherever anybody's at. If somebody has that orientation or they're interested in that orientation, then it's, I guess, it's part of the something that I can offer, or I feel like I can offer anyway.
And I'd love to circle back to that one, but before we do, let's explore your own journey. What got you into psychotherapy in the first place?
Yeah, right. Well, I suppose I definitely started meditation and mindfulness stuff before I got into community services and therapy, because community services led me to getting into counselling and psychotherapy. So I had already had some kind of interest, like right from I think I got into meditation when I was when I was about 20, and so there was already this inquisitiveness that I had about how I ticked, so to speak, and wanting a deeper connection to things, and part of some of the influences I had, it was also around service to the community, and I guess I had an inclination towards that. And so I started off, actually when I first moved to Melbourne 20 years ago, I joined a sort of a soup kitchen, feeding sort of homeless people, that type of thing. And I really liked it. I really enjoyed it, even though at the time I wasn't in community service or anything to do with therapy. I was actually a cabinet maker, and I was doing, working all day as making furniture. And then I would do this in the evenings. It was just once a week. And even though it was going towards, 11 o'clock at night sometimes, I still have to get up early the next day. But I never felt like I was tired. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed connecting with the people that I met. And So I decided, well, I'll do some study and try, and take it a step further, which led me to working in community welfare agencies. And the first one I worked in, was in a men's shelter, working with homeless men. And that progressed to sort of working at drug and alcohol, and then mental health. And at some point I wanted to take it deeper. I mean, my initial work was all around, providing support, around linking into other agencies, that type of thing, doing outreach work. And then I just wanted to take it a little bit deeper and see how helping people to overcome their challenges in life, not just supporting them in their day-to-day activities. And I suppose that thought, well, okay, I wanted to do some kind of counselling, and I did some Lifeline volunteer work again, which sowed seeds. So, okay, I want to do this a bit more, and then that led to sort of studying Gestalt therapy, and I finished that in 2012.
All right. With your mindfulness practices back when you were 20, was this a common thing where you
that's a good question. I was definitely no, back because I grew up in England and in Nottingham, and so I didn't know anybody who was into that stuff. It wasn't like a friend of mine gave me a book, even though he never read it. He said, "Oh, this is on transcendental meditation." He said, "You might like this." So I went and did it, and then I really enjoyed when I was taught how to meditate. And then I was talking to my friends about it, and they all thought I was a bit weird. And so I just learned to not. It was sort of my dirty shame thing, like, oh, I just meditate on the quiet, So it wasn't popular back then. So yeah, but I liked it, so it was good.
Do you remember what book it was?
It was no, I can't remember the title. It was just an introduction. It was quite a thin book, Introduction to Transcendental Meditation. And then I think I read another book by the founder, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, I think his name was. And most of it went way over my head, but I still liked it. And it kind of said, "Oh, you can be enlightened in 8 years." And I thought, okay, I'll be enlightened by the time I'm 30. That was a bit of a over the top fantasy I had back then. But anyway, it sort of sowed the seeds and set me on the path, so to speak. Yeah.
We all have a process of finding ourselves when we're in our teens to 20s, and then that idea of, hey, I'm going to have it all together by the time I'm 30. That's a very attractive idea, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah. And at the time, now I look back, it was also an avoidant pattern as well, because I was very shy, wasn't super secure in myself, and I thought, oh, this was a way of sort of, and now they'll call it spiritual bypassing, where I think I didn't want to look at my stuff. I just wanted to, be more confident, and meditation and mindfulness offered this. And sure, I got benefits from it 100%. But it was still kind of like, there was still a strong avoiding process for me involved in like retreating from the world, that type of thing. Even though I was traveling and all this sort of stuff, but I could see how it suited my personality at the time. But it was still, like I said, I think you get these things in your life, come into your life for reasons, and it was definitely suited where I was at, and gave me the things that I needed at the time as well. But I guess later on, I could see through some of the limitations that it was. Definitely could see through some of the limitations.
What was mindfulness like back then? Like, what kind of practices did you do?
Well, that transcendental meditation was it was like a mantra meditation. So their version of a mantra is that it's basically a sound without a meaning, and then you just concentrate on that. You just keep repeating that sound and to yourself. It's not a forced thing. So and the idea is you're just building up concentration, and as you build up concentration, that stills the mind, brings quietness and peace. And like mindfulness, as our minds do, they wander all over the place. But then you just bring it back your awareness and concentration to this sound. And that's its sole function, from what I could see. It's just a point of focus that you keep bringing your mind back to as a means, like I said, as a means to help bring quietness. Because as we bring quietness and stillness, then you're in more in contact with yourself, that can allow deeper connection feelings like love and joy and happiness to come to the surface. But having said that, it also brings up all the hindrances and the blocks to those things as well. So I think one of the things, I'll just say as a side note, one of the perceptions I think is changing. One of the perceptions around mindfulness and meditation, that it's just going to make you happy all the time. That it can, in a sense that it can bring an overall peace, but it also can bring up, and because that's a part of its function, it brings up what's in the way of being more happy and more peaceful. So, some material can get from our past or whatever can come to the surface, but it always seems to do it in an intelligent way, not in a sort of bludgeoning kind of way. It's sort of what we only experience, what we usually we only experience or get to work on what we're capable of processing and working on, if that makes sense.
You only bring up the things that you're able to work on?
There's like it seems to me, it's like we work on what we process in our lives, if you like, comes to the fore when we have the ability and capacity to work through it. If something's too difficult, too hard, it's not just going to come to the surface and be processed if the person hasn't got those capacities to do it. And I mean, from my own personal experience, like some of the material that I've had to work through the years on myself through the diamond approach, that if I tried to work through that when I was in my 20s, it just wouldn't have worked. I didn't have the skills or the capacity. So you have to work on where you're at and where your capacity is at the time, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
Have you met anybody or seen people who are just never able to bring that sort of stuff up?
That's a good question. I wouldn't say I've never. I'm trying to think. I can't think of any examples. I mean, for some people, it's not, that's not their cup of tea. 100%. It's not for everybody. The diamond approach is just not for everybody. And so I think people know, they won't participate. And so from a therapy point of view, I think if somebody doesn't want to work on their stuff, so to speak, they just don't attend. So my personal belief is that everybody has the potential to heal and become whole and grow and evolve into whatever image they have of themselves. Whether everybody can do that all the time, probably not, but I still like to have this. I definitely believe that if you've got a sincerity and there's capacity, yes, I think people can definitely heal. That's why I'm in this field, because I believe that people, when they're willing, you've got to have a willingness, right? If you don't have the willingness, then nothing's going to happen. And you sort of have to believe it as well. So they go hand in hand, willingness and a sort of belief that, I can heal, I can grow, I can evolve. Then I think life has a way of supporting you to do that.
I could imagine how people who have little belief in themselves could come up with that sense. Okay, I can do it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's harder, but yeah, it doesn't matter. I guess we're complicated. Like, you can have that belief, then you might have another part of you might go, well, yeah, I can. So for me, part of therapy is working on those parts, the different elements of ourselves. I'm not all of one and nothing of the other. We tend to be a mixed bag of, one part of me thinks I'm great, another part of me thinks I'm not, that type of thing, put it crudely.
I've noticed in the population, so to speak, as if we're like part of a elite, unit in the population. That's so different to the population. No, what I mean to say is, so many people have just kind of like, nah, it's me. I'm just me. I'm Emil. I'm Rob, and I'm just one person. How can I think that I'm more than one? it's kind of like an inbuilt bias towards only being a unity of people. And but us in the therapeutic field, we kind of see that there's so many differences that we feel or we can relate to in one particular moment, because a part of me feels like this, a part of me feels like that.
Yeah.
What's your sense of I guess from a very general point of view, acknowledging, like, what would you say to somebody who would kind of say, nah, I'm me, I've never changed, I'm never going to change, it's just who I am?
Yeah, I guess I would say, well, I would bring in sort of an absolute question. So is that absolutely true, that you've never changed ever since that you were born, since you were a little kid to this point in the here and now, that there's no part of you that's never changed in that whole time? You've been exactly the same. That I'd sort of ask that question, and then I'd also clarify it with there is a part of us that does, feels pretty consistent, like a felt sense of who I am, like for me, who I am as Rob. There's a felt sense that this is who I am. So I identify with that, if you like. But then I also acknowledge that this person who identifies as Rob, a felt sense of Rob, can have different orientations to the world, different sort of, one part of me can feel like, a bit driven sometimes, and I want to do things and achieve things. And then there's another part of me that, wants to be lazy and procrastinates. But that they come under the umbrella, if you like, of this felt sense of, I'm at the moment, I feel like Rob type thing. Does that make sense? Or there's an awareness that I'm me type thing.
Would that be the difference between people who really achieve things in life and people who kind of sit back and just don't get anywhere in life? The person who's able to see that there are different forces at work and is willing to kind of move forward? Or do you have to be like one-minded about it? Like, the person that comes to my mind is Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, who's kind of like came from one area of, he went from wrestling to being the highest paid actor in show business, and he has so many other stuff in the works. Yeah. Do you have to like single-mindedly like commit yourself to something, or do you have to say, okay, well, there's so many parts of me at work here? At what time does it lose its utility?
Yeah, I think Dwayne Johnson, I mean, he's definitely a driven person. He knows what he wants and what he's going for, and he uses that sort of vision and the goals that he sets for himself, and he goes for it. So, but it doesn't mean that, and that's okay. It doesn't mean though he doesn't have conflicting parts in him, or other parts that, because we see one side of Dwayne Johnson. We have a persona, the sort of Jungian term that, the Latin for a mask that we wear to the outside world, right? And Dwayne Johnson might have a good mask. I mean, I've seen him interviewed a few times, and he seems like a funny kind of guy, easygoing guy. He's charismatic, and he's got a lot of positive qualities, I would say. But it doesn't mean we don't see that's the public face, right? We don't see the other side of Dwayne Johnson that maybe, has darker elements to it, or he feels more sad than he shows and all that sort of stuff. I think that's more the human experience that I'm familiar with. And that's the two sides of who we are. He's still Dwayne Johnson. Still, he has, like I said, has these positive qualities, but who knows what he's like when he's at home, how he relates to some people in maybe negative ways or positive ways. I don't know, but nobody's like that all the time, unless you've really come a long way in your own evolution and you've sort of worked through heaps of stuff, and you generally connected at a really deeper level. And I suppose that's more the spiritual orientation to being a human being. But from a psychological perspective, if you really like most of us are, we're identified with our psychological material, how we grew up, etc., how we were conditioned, then that's a mixed bag. We're complicated, and there's shadow side, however you want to look at it. Most people have. I haven't met anybody who's not got that element to themselves.
It does help in personal development when you only sleep 3 to 5 hours a night, like Mr. Johnson. Really
Yes.
interesting. So I guess turning it back a little bit with the Gestalt side of things, because many of our listeners might have no idea what Gestalt means. Let me. Can you define the term Gestalt and then talk about your experience with Gestalt?
Okay, so Gestalt's a German word. And you're right, most people don't know what Gestalt is. Even Gestalt people have troubles defining what Gestalt is. Basically, my understanding of Gestalt means it describes a whole. The trouble is that it's a German word. It's difficult to translate it into English. But my understanding of it is it basically means a whole, something that's a whole. So like the human body is a Gestalt, right? It's made up of all these parts. This is one of the classic sayings in Gestalt, that the human body, we are greater, our parts, who we are is greater than some of our parts. So like Emil is made up of, all these organs, bones, tissue, eyes, mind, brain, whatever type thing. And that defines you as a Gestalt as a whole. But you could take all those different parts out from you, like put all your organs, that's a bit gruesome looking, but put all your organs to one side, your mind over here, and all this sort of stuff. If you separated them, they would just be the parts. They're not necessarily the Gestalt of who makes you. But in their own, but you could say of a heart is its own Gestalt, because it's a heart, and it has embedded in the heart is all the tissues, the molecules, atoms, all that sort of stuff. So it's a Gestalt. Does that sort of make sense? It's kind of that's the way I look at it. It's a whole.
It's kind of it just reminds me of the term university. Someone once said that university is unity in diversity, and you find a unity within the diversity of the whole. That's interesting. Okay, so the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. Philosophically, if you take apart a person, at what point does it stop being him? Like Theseus's ship. Have you heard of the story of Theseus's ship?
Yes, yeah, I have, but I can't remember it off the top of my head.
Okay, so
it's like if you change the wood and the ship, is that the one? If you rebuild the ship, is it still Theseus's ship, even though it's the same shape and design, etc.? Is that it?
That's correct. So kind of like there's a point in philosophical thought called essentialism. There is an essence to every thing that makes it what it is, kind of like a Platonic ideal. But in terms of, and for those of us who have no idea what Platonic ideal means, it's just like an idea. I'm going to brutalize it here. An idea you have about something that stands in contrast to how you see the thing in the natural world. Like a circle there's a better idea of a circle more than our trying to attempts to draw a circle, so to speak.
Right.
Let's go back to essentialism. Theseus' ship, there's a ship that was docked at Theseus, a Greek city-state that left the place, and it kind of traveled around the Mediterranean and comes back. Along its travels, it loses its crew, replaces its crew, loses its wood, its sails, everything. So by the end of the journey, it's replaced by every single thing you could imagine. Is it still the same ship that comes back to port? Is that a good analogy for what you're trying to get at in terms of the essence and the diversity of what we find ourselves?
Yeah, right. It's a good question. Because it's what I was thinking when you were saying that, it's like, if I started losing my limbs, God forbid that I don't, but I lost my legs, and then they would replace those legs with, sort of, just for argument's sake, the robotic legs, and I replaced my arms with, it's the same sort of thing, and I lose my arms and I replace my arms, that type of thing. Yeah. And then I get, I have a heart attack, and then somebody else's heart, I have a heart transplant replacement process, whatever. Is that still me? I would say yes, because I'm still the sum of my parts. So I'm still a Gestalt. But if you took everything away, then I'm not. So, but there's something else happening. I mean, maybe it's not a good example to use myself, because I've never actually seen this, but I've heard it many, many times. When somebody sees somebody who's passed away, they know that they're not them anymore. There might be a body there, but there's not them. So it makes it a bit more complicated, I suppose. But to answer your Theseus question, on for me, on one level, it is the same ship, because that's who they naming it that ship. That's how people recognize that ship. On another level, you could say, well, no, it's a different ship. But then the same, coming back to the human body, all our cells replace every 7 years, don't they? I think that's what I remember from biology. Yeah. So yeah, right. So I think it's 7 years that all our cells are completely replaced. But I mean, that's not all at once. So it's over time. So am I the same person from 7 years ago because I've got a completely different body? I'd say yes, I'm still the same person. And also another one that kind of semi-freaks me out is the relationship between how many cells we have in our body versus how many bacteria live in our body. There's supposed to be like 60 billion cells in our body, or something like 60 to 70 billion. There's actually more microorganisms. There's just over like 70 billion microorganisms living in our body. So what am I? Am I a human body, or am I a walking, bacteria factory or something?
This is going to freak you out. There's about 200 million living microbes that live just on your eyebrows.
Cool. Yeah, right. That's good. I won't be licking my eyebrows anytime soon then.
If you reach.
Yeah.
That's the way. Okay.
No, I don't have that skill. No. But anyway.
I guess
it's fascinating. Yeah.
The reason I asked that question is because it's pretty relevant when it comes to personal development. And in terms of counselling or psychotherapy, if you consider what you're changing and what you're replacing it with, often people have the idea, well, if I change this about myself, then I'm not me. I'm changing something so deep within myself. Think of drug use, or think of that guy the stoner, or whatever it is. It becomes an identity over time, and you change that, you become less yourself. And so I guess the thesis for Theseus's ship is the sense that, okay, you can change things if you believe that what's coming back is still who you are, but a better and a more improved version, like Rob 2.0 rather than
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So let's circle back again to Gestalt. What does Gestalt actually? What was your experience? How did you hear about Gestalt first of all, and what made you do the training? What was your experience of the training? All that sort of stuff.
Yeah, right. Well, I suppose at the time when I first, I guess I felt like I was in my own personal development. I felt like I'd reached a plateau in myself. I felt like I was not really moving ahead within myself. I felt like I was a bit stuck, and just felt stuck. And so at the time, it was around 2007, I decided I wanted to do it. And then I also had this interest in wanting to deepen. I was working in drug and alcohol as a counsellor as well, and I sort of didn't have any formalized training of any kind, just incidental stuff here and there. So it was a mixed bag. So one part of me wanted to have learn a more in-depth method. I was also feeling a bit stuck within myself from a personal development point of view. And so at that time, that's when I started Diamond Approach. And also, I can't remember exactly, but I think I looked at Gestalt and I knew that it would be really challenging and would really challenge me in a way around its training process, because it's very experiential, it's more relational, it's very much more about in contact with your feelings, etc. Not that all therapies aren't, but they've got a particular emphasis, I think, in Gestalt. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm kind of like, I didn't know a lot about it. It's not like I met somebody who said do Gestalt. It was more like an intuitive sort of, that felt right for me. I needed to push my edge, my fear edge, to be exact. And so I decided to do it. And yeah, it was, yeah, definitely pushed my edge. And I really loved it. It definitely resonated with my own values as well. So it was a good pick for me.
Give me an example, or experiment with me on what a Gestalt approach would look like in terms of training.
Right.
So that those who have no idea about that type of approach could get a sense of it.
Well, Gestalt is very, it's very much about in the moment process. So whatever's happening in the here and now in your experience. So it's all about, it's not just about what's happening in your mind and your thoughts. It's also what's happening in your feelings. But I think interestingly, they add more about what's happening in the body. So in your sensate experience, what your body's sensing, what it's feeling, what are the emotions, and also what are your thoughts about stuff. But it also has a systemic approach as well. It's not, they don't, in Gestalt, they don't, because of the word Gestalt, they don't just see each of us as an individual, where they see the individual is connected and influenced by the environment and the relationships that we have. That's how we know ourselves, is in relationship to somebody else. For example, that's why, putting people in isolation is torture. And because we relate to each other and know each other through relating. So, and so Gestalt has a strong lens on the relational field that's happening between the therapist and the client, but also what's happening in the broader system that we live in. So it's it's looking at your internal systems, but also looking at your external environment as well. So does that answer your question? There's two parts to it.
No, it was a good one. So it brings up a memory of when here in Melbourne, again, we're in another lockdown, and have an isolation of people, so to speak. And if we remember, I remember back in 2020 when my kids had to spend much of their time at, schooling from home and not seeing another child for a significant period of time. My son started to make friends with inanimate objects, and it was really interesting to see how he would eat a nugget, and he'll be like, I'm going to save this nugget because this nugget's my friend. And he would like talk to the nugget, but he will eat the other nuggets. And he had his brother there, but the only other people that he had were adults. And that when he went back to school, that all went. So it's a really interesting sense of wanting to relate to something else that I don't even know. It brings emotions to me right now because I see the effect that this sort of stuff has. And from a Gestalt point of view, I mean, that memory brings up a relational, emotional experience for me with regards to my son. How would a therapist address that?
Well, I can't speak for other Gestalt therapists, but how I would address that would be, in Gestalt, we would say that was a creative adjustment. So your son was adapting to the field conditions that he was living in, i.e. the lockdown, disconnection from his friends, school, that type of thing. And so limited relational contact that he clearly needed. And so the creative adjustment was that he started forming, as you say, relational patterns with a nugget or other. And I would support that. I would go, well, I'll be asking, if I was in your shoes, I'd be saying, how does that make you feel? What's good about it? Because clearly he let it go as soon as he went back to school. So I wouldn't have sort of, and clearly he didn't, I wouldn't have dismissed it or, shamed him about it or anything like that. I would have supported that process and see what the impact was. And if it kept him happy and entertained and whatever, then to me that sounded very clever. It was an intelligent, even though to an adult's eyes it seems a bit, and it's understandably he makes you feel sad, but it's actually okay. Well, he's feeling, and also I suppose you could have asked, I would have asked, what is there anything we could have done differently, or what are you missing? So it's acknowledging really what he's missing, that type of thing. But I wouldn't have stopped it because it was working, right?
Yeah, it served a purpose for the time.
Yeah, sure. If it was ongoing, and never and it didn't change, he was growing up and he kept talking to his nugget, then you would say there was something, that would need addressing. But the fact that as soon as the lockdown finished, he just drops it, went to school, and it was good again, so to speak, then perfect. I think it was a cool thing to do, really. I think, yeah.
Yeah, it would have been a very moldy nugget by that point.
Yeah, right. You'd have to dip it in some sort of lacquer or something to preserve it. Yeah,
that's the way. So you spoke about Gestalt. Are there what kind of actually, I think you've answered that question with how it might look like, exploring into a person's more felt experience and how that relates to their world at large, and how that relates to other people, and how we are affected by others in our day-to-day functioning. Are there any other words that you'd like to share about the Gestalt approach that you found either really useful or very just not helpful, or there's just kind of gaps that you've noticed?
Sure. Another key element of Gestalt work is what we call the experiment. So Gestalt, I'll just backtrack a little bit. Gestalt is about increasing the individual's awareness of their world. And so when you have increased awareness, so the theory goes, when you have increased awareness and understanding of what's actually happening, rather than it being out of awareness or unconscious, however you want to describe it, then you have more choice. So when you have choice, then obviously you've got choice points. You can say, well, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. So Gestalt is always about creating more choice, more and increasing awareness. And they believe to do that, you do that through in the moment processing type thing. So an element of that, so to help more choice or to bring more awareness, probably is a better word, more awareness to somebody's experience, is experimenting. And so what I mean is that trying on something new. So it's always invitational. I'm trying to think of an example. So basically, say if you've got a really quiet person and they're introverted, don't really not used to speaking their voice or shouting or being angry. An experiment might be to say, oh, what would it be like to speak loudly right now? So to practice, what if I said they shouted no or yes or something, to a client? Then you could see what the client could then see. Well, was that easy? Was it hard? What was the impact? That type of thing. So you're just sort of playing around, if you like, and trying on new things to see how they fit as a way of countering the defenses that we have or the inhibitions that we have of how we express ourselves. Because Gestalt is all about being fluid in the moment and having different responses according to the context you're in. Because generally we get conditioned and through our childhood to have a set responses which worked back then, but they don't necessarily work in the here and now in new contexts. So the idea is to go, say, like, for example, some people don't, they learnt as a child that being angry is not appropriate. So they learnt to sort of hold their anger in. They're just, quiet and peaceful, or maybe not peaceful, but seemingly calm. Never get ruffled, never get angry. Well, from my point of view, that's not really a healthy response, because sometimes they're not able to set boundaries with other people. So, so learning to be angry might be in the right situation where, in the sense, not acting out anger. I'm talking about, say, somebody's said something to you and it hurt your feelings, it was inappropriate. So anger is a natural response to that because there's a boundary violation, if you like. And so being assertive, if you want to be assertive, having that sort of natural anger, natural aggression as they say in somatic experiencing, is completely appropriate. But, then if the boss, you go to work and your boss sort of shouts at you or says something, you can't shout at your boss if he gives you more work. That's just not appropriate, right? So it's all context dependent. So in the with your boss, you might have to be more, compliant and go, yeah, you might hate it, but you don't act out. But you've got fluidity. That's what I'm trying to, I guess that maybe I didn't give a good example, but you've got fluidity in how you respond to people. That's sort of one of the aims of Gestalt. What stops fluidity? What stops you being, sometimes you may need to be quiet, sometimes you need to be expressive, that type of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of thought attached to that one, and often thought is the first one that goes when you're feeling really emotional. So as an example, a child, now I can consider, I've got young kids, one's 6 and one's 10. And so
yeah,
a lot of emotional ups and downs when it comes to children. What I try to encourage is different ways of expressing the anger rather than kind of holding it in or losing yourself. But even as parents, I mean, we get frustrated with our kids and say, no, all right, listen, go to your room, stay there, and only come out when you're feeling better. And then there's another part of me that's kind of like the more patient part that's like, okay, well, let me stop, let me get down to your level and see what you're feeling and see if we can kind of go through that. And some kids might just need a hug, other kids might need to just get rid of that. Like my older son gets a lot out of wrestling and using his tantrums to kind of push things out. My younger son, if you cuddle him, he's pretty good, or get down to his level and that sort of stuff. So it's really interesting how parents out there who might be listening, how they respond to their kids from an emotional point of view. Do you have sort of tips to navigate those processes, like when a kid's having a tantrum, from a Gestalt point of view or body-based point of view, how to manage that?
Yeah, I suppose if a kid's having a tantrum, I think for me, it's about listening to what they're having a tantrum about. I mean, obviously, you kind of still have to be firm. There's nothing wrong with being firm in a gentle way and setting a boundary with a child, because all children need boundaries. They change. Those boundaries change as they grow, type thing. But children, from my understanding, I'll just put a caveat, I'm not an expert on child development, but what I understand anyway is that all children need boundaries. When they don't have boundaries, then they don't like it. It can be dysregulating. They don't know where they stand, etc. But as I say, those boundaries change as children get older. So if a child's throwing a tantrum, then you don't want that child to be picking up things and throwing objects or etc. Whatever they're doing, kicking, biting, whatever. You can't. So you have to be kind of clear about that's not okay, obviously. But I say but it's not to. In my book, it's not to push down the feeling. The idea is to be with the feeling the child's experiencing. So if the child's frustrated, angry, what's the child frustrated, angry about? And so for me, it's about having a conversation or trying to understand the child's point of view and seeing if you can address that, because then the child feels heard. And like I said, you don't have to condone everything the child's doing or saying, but it's kind of from a relational point of view, you're listening, and that's what Gestalt would say. You're listening to what the child's saying. From a somatic experiencing point of view, you're respecting and honoring the child's energy and emotion. I even in Gestalt would say the same thing. You're respecting what the child's feeling. You're not rejecting it, you're not shaming it, you're just saying. And so ideally you're modeling how to be with that feeling, and so the child doesn't learn to feel shame about what they're experiencing. And you're also supporting the child as they learn to stay with the feeling, because usually, well, tantrums like the terrible twos and all that sort of stuff, children at those ages their emotions are so big that their nervous systems can't tolerate the charge in the emotion. We learn to tolerate charge in emotions as we get older, but again, it's the parents' responsibility of the caregivers or whatever, teachers, however, this can apply to anybody who works, with children, is supporting the child to be with the feeling as long as they can. Sometimes they need soothing, sometimes they need recognition, so I guess it's context dependent, but it's about being, for me, the key point, I keep saying, is not to reject and shame the feeling. That's what I think is really important. But it's also not condoning if they're acting out, in dangerous ways or hurtful ways, whatever. So you can have healthy boundaries whilst communicating a sense of okayness. It's okay to be the way you are.
I think you're spot on with that. And I really like the way that you say to model that type of behavior and those type of responses that might be useful in those situations. Because often kids, they learn more from modeling from their parents than anything else that they're told. So if a parent loses themselves when a child is having a tantrum and the parent gets angry, like we've all done as parents, I don't know your experience,
sure.
You kind of,
yeah, I have, yeah.
it comes down to like, okay, well, how does one contain themselves when they're triggered by their own kids being triggered? I guess it's more general. I think there's a deeper question to that one, and we'll get to that in terms of somatic experiencing type of stuff. But
okay,
as a very broad brush, how can a parent consider responding in those situations?
I think it's another Gestalt term. It's called rupture and repair. It's the relational piece again, that when we consistently, as humans, rupture relationships, whatever, have arguments, falling outs, whatever you want to call it. That's pretty normal. So the repair part is, are you willing to sort of have a conversation about it? So for parents, as you say, all of us have made mistakes that we regret and feel bad about afterwards. But with all the research shows that the repair is really important. I think the damage that's done is when there's no repair. So if a parent messes up and feels like they went over the top and shouted when they didn't want to shout, etc., the key to that is just to repair it and be honest and apologise, and then have a conversation and just be honest and said, oh yeah, mummy was feeling really bad at the moment. I'm sorry, it wasn't your fault, etc. And I love you, and give them a hug. That repair is so powerful and kids have such a strong, because they love their parents so much, that repair, there's just water off a duck's back. And there might obviously be effective various from child to child, but that's just the repair that's really important. It's when parents ignore their own behavior, are not owning it, and don't repair with the child that causes the problems. Then it confuses the child, because they sing, well, I got angry, you got angry at me, you told me off for being angry, but you got angry, and that's okay. That's just a confusing message. So if I in my own situation, if I got angry and I realized that was completely inappropriate, I apologize. So I actually feel good when I do that. And I haven't been in a situation where really, there's probably is, but I can't remember one, but not with children anyway, where that's not received really well.
And there are lots of parents for various reasons who would never get down to that level of apologizing, because their concept of being a parent is, you have to listen to what I say, and that's my status as a parent, and whatever I do is kind of okay. But
sure.
Probably not as clear cut as that, but
sure. No, some parents are like that. Definitely, I agree with you. That's just the way they are. There's a whole range of people how they parent, and there's no judgment on that. I'm just saying this is I'm speaking from an ideal point of view, and a healthy sort of therapeutic point of view, and healthy parenting perspective. Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask, do you have children? Like, how has this I'm not a step parent at the moment, but I was a step parent, so I had the joy of that. And I say joy in both literally and as as the challenge that afforded at the time as well. So yeah. Yeah, I guess that those questions, because there's a lot of people who might say, well, you just don't know how it feels because you don't have kids, or you don't have.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's totally fair enough. And yeah, I mean, I understand that. I do in the context of my life type thing as a step parent. I understand. I definitely understand it. Yeah, I'm not a biological parent, so that I don't know how. I can't comment if that makes things different. But I still cared and loved the stepdaughter that I helped raise. So and I saw the mistakes that I made because of my own stuff and how I was parented, etc. And so I feel like I do have some lived experience to comment. Yeah.
I think it's really important because you get this thrown back all the time for people who, whether it's parenting or anything else, if you haven't
right.
it, you don't know what it feels like. If you haven't been sick, then you don't know what it feels like to be sick, or
yeah, got you. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. If you don't have the lived experience, then how can you relate to me? And the way I sort of respond to that is I say, well, that's true on one level, but that's true on every level, because the way, say, if I was depressed and you were depressed, and we could say we could relate to each other because there's some commonalities, but actually from a Gestalt point of view, it's very unique. The way you experience depression or anxiety or any challenges, anger, is different on subtle levels, and it's different from mine. So it's not, unless you're completely empathic and attuned 100% to the other person and live their experience, which I know some people have that ability, then you can't say, well, you don't understand. And then the other side of it, so the Gestalt would say, well, help me understand it. So you be inquisitive and inquire. And also another side of it is, well, I'm a human being. I sort of know, like I may not know, say, how somebody's experienced a particular kind of trauma type thing, and I don't have that lived experience, say gang rape or something like that. But I'm a human being that's experienced pain. I know what loss is, I know what betrayal is, and I know what a whole range of human emotions are, so I can relate on that level. So it's not, I think it's the Gestalt way, but it's my way. I would never presume to know what it was like. So if somebody said that to me, I would completely honor it and say yes, and then I would be honest about, say, well, I would just say what I've just said about I'm a human being and I'll try to understand you. I have got had my own life journey. I'm not a perfect person sitting here type thing. I've had my own trials and tribulations. It's just part of the deal of being a human person.
I think what you said is pivotal to understanding human relationships. Even though I don't know how you're feeling, can you help me understand? That sense of that invitation, can you help me to understand? That brings the onus back on the person, and it says, okay, well, do I feel like I can trust this person enough, or hey, this person actually wants to hear me out and understand me from my point of view? Because you're right, not everyone has the same experience of trauma, of depression, of anxiety, of parenting, and we get this all the time. I would assume with the work that we do, if we haven't experienced the unique issue that the client is coming to us with, for some clients, it's like, no, I don't think you can help me because you haven't been there, until you create that rapport. And then they're like, okay, well, maybe this person can, or you give them a reason to trust you like you have. Well, help me understand.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's the job of the counsellor therapist, is to as much as they can, is to sit in the shoes of the person that they're listening to. So part of the therapeutic process is, is being there with the person. So, actively engaging and being present and fully present in a way that many clients have never experienced before. And that's where the therapeutic change can be, is because you're relating to the person that you're with. And all the research shows anyway, it's not really the method, generally speaking, it's not the method that produces positive outcomes. It's actually relating and, as you say, building rapport with the person that you're working with. And so they feel, as you say, can build up that trust and be witnessed in a way that maybe they haven't been witnessed before, and supported in a way that they may not have been supported before. Because, you know, from my own experience, I'm not an expert in this, and it's still a growing edge, work in progress type thing, is that my empathy muscle gets as grows doing, you know, I'm lucky that Din's working, because I can feel like it grows to some degree. So where you can say, oh, you don't know what it's like, but then you can start feeling the other person. When our defenses start relaxing, our capacity to relate to each other and our sensitivity gets enhanced. And all of us have this potential where we can feel more. I mean, for me, the human experience where the majority of us in is really limited. I think that's why I like personal development, because I think the potential for a human being is quite profound and deep, and we have capacities that haven't been touched yet. And so one of those is how we relate to each other and how we feel into each other and know each other at deeper and deeper levels.
Have you ever met anybody who's a true empath, so to speak?
A true empath. I've met people, yeah, that definitely have that skill and are tuned in a way. They're more kind of spiritual sort of leaders, teachers, if you like, that have that capacity for sure. Yeah.
Do you think
you wouldn't know if you just saw them from face to face? It's more of an experience, and and just being around them.
Do you think there are gender differences between women and men who can empathize more or less?
No, I think that's one of our socialized, conditioned responses. I think, you know, I don't want to cast any aspersions on anybody here, so I'll make some. I've got a caveat. These are broad generalizations. I think women generally have better skills initially in relating to each other, and than men. Men have a different worldview and orientation. But I 100% believe in my own experience and with some of my friends that there's no, like, when it says like, oh, women, you know, are more nurturing, more loving, or more giving, and etc., and men are more strong and assertive, powerful, that type of thing. Those are the stereotypes that we get conditioned into, right? I think that's exactly what they are, socialized conditions. Men and women have the same qualities and attributes. I don't think it's gender specific. I think it's individual specific. Women can be strong, powerful, and assertive, and still be loving, caring, and open. So can men. So it's just a question, and I think that's why I like the sort of more transpersonal work, because that's when it starts. That kind of work starts unpacking those sort of identities that we think we are, what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman. It doesn't mean it's not, you know, if you're cisgendered or you've got fluid, etc. That doesn't mean you don't, that's not your truth, but the qualities, you know, like I've just said, strength, power, joy, whatever it is, I don't think that's got anything to do with gender at all. I think it's a human attribute. There's attributes that all humans can have.
So if you consider some of the arguments around the evolutionary process of how humans have developed, and what generally makes females more nurturing is because they need to raise children.
100%.
And males needed to go out and hunt and protect the tribe and that sort of stuff. Does it throw a different level of analysis there? Because you have the psychological evolutionary approach, the biological evolutionary approach, and the social and sociological approach of understanding the differences from nurturing. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, well, for people who may not be as nurturing, can they learn or can they not? I've done interview with a person called James Fallon, who talks about psychopathy and the total lack in some people of seeing things from other people's points of view because of a biological imperative that they've experienced at some point in their life. So I know I've just said a whole bunch of stuff, but considering and balancing those approaches and the utility of understanding those, how does that?
Yeah. I don't disagree with you from an evolutionary point of view that those all those things you said are true. And then, for some people, that they might have a psychopathy where they're more psychopathic in their orientation, and they don't have that empathy capacity. But that's more they're more the exception. I mean, okay, there's a lot, there's quite a few in our culture. You don't have to look at business, etc., to see how many psychopaths are probably CEOs. They've done research and all that sort of stuff. They reckon it's 30% or something. So, but I guess I'm speaking from a broader, general possibility of humankind having those skills. So sure, mothers definitely need those attributes. They get access to those attributes around caring, selflessness, nurture, for the baby. And as you say, the fathering figure, I think this needs to change because all these dynamics, the nuclear family is all changing now with same-sex relationships, etc. And but it's that's definitely true, I think, but it doesn't mean the father or the fathering figure has those qualities of feeling nurture and being open-hearted and caring and being vulnerable and open, whilst at the same time having qualities of being really strong, powerful, and same with women. I mean, there's plenty of stories out there of with women, mothers having to lift the car because their child's been trapped. Crazy stuff, so I think I guess I'm speaking to the potential really, and positing the possibility that we don't have, that humans have more a range of qualities of feeling at our disposal if we're willing to have a look at them and go there, type thing.
Yeah, I came across some research more recently, also on violence. A book called I think it's The Anatomy of Violence, by a researcher who investigates psychopathy and violence in human populations and the history behind that, evolution behind that. It was really interesting to see how much context plays in how these kinds of traits bring themselves up. He talked about very remote South American tribes who had a higher genetic predisposition towards violence because of certain genetic markers that didn't regulate their neurochemicals of dopamine, serotonin, and that sort of stuff, as well as other people like perhaps you and me, or probably the general population. But that was based on the necessity in their context. So what that means is a tribesman who grew up with more abundance, so more food sources, tended to have less of those violent tendencies. And those violent tendencies, from a genetic point of view, they weren't as highly valued, though they were still violent. They still had an underlying predisposition, but it didn't come about in terms of
right.
Whereas there were other tribes who they would actually start counting how many people they murdered, and that would be seen as another rung in the ladder of social hierarchy, because they grew up in environments that were less well tended, and they had to go and fight for their stuff. And women were, in those tribes, the women were more attracted to and bore more children with the ones that were more violent. It was so interesting how all this sort of stuff can come about from biological and sociological, I don't even know if sociological makes sense, maybe anthropological point of view.
No, it makes sense. It sound, the way you're describing it, for me, it's like, where in those tribes, it was socially and culturally important to have those qualities. And then again, I don't know anything about this, but epigenetics talks about the environment that you're in influences the genetics, and then the genetics can have an influence on how you are and what you respond to in the world. And it sounds, the way you describe that, one of those tribes is that violence is valued more. So then that social environment stimulates the genetic predisposition towards being more violent. So as you say, the violent gene gets more activated because that was socially accepted, socially sanctioned, and socially desired. And then it gets reinforced because the women were attracted more to more. So then that genetics then gets reproduced in future generations. So you can see how it gets reinforced. And then but does that mean it's permanent? Maybe, I don't know, for a few generations, maybe. Then you could put some other stimulus in there where there's more peacemaking, and then that it's not socially sanctioned, and so they get more ostracized the more violent you are. It's not accepted, like, more similar to our culture, I suppose, and then not become more peace loving. How long that takes, I'm just guessing, really, but that's how I see it in my head anyway. Yeah.
It's so interesting, and I think this is a final point I'd like to make on that one. I used to come from a therapeutic lens until I started doing a lot more research into this, because I think it's so interesting to me, because it's based on empathy and being able to relate, and from a clinical point of view, that's really important for me. And so understanding the caveats behind that sort of stuff is really important. So one thing that I thought was the epigenetic influence, and for those who might not be aware, epigenetics is how the environment brings about those types of genes that we might have a predisposition for. If we have a violent gene, so to speak, even though there are like 50 different types of genes that can influence, violence, if we have that gene and we get raised in a really beautiful, loving environment, we don't tend to be violent. And yet there are some evidence to the contrary. For example, adoption studies where children who have been adopted out to very beautiful, loving parents, but they came from generations of violence and criminality, but never met their biological parent, and how they still took the path of violence. And there's so many stories out there and research that kind of goes into that, but that's not the purpose of today's discussion. I just thought it was a good caveat to kind of discuss in terms of empathy, in terms of connecting.
Yeah, right. It is interesting. It's well, I mean, the picture you painted, it's more complicated than we actually really understand on this level. Well, our understanding is growing, but it's a complicated process, and because there's that idea of nature nurture, because that's what I was hearing is which is more dominant. And the last example you gave is that the nature was more dominant than the nurture. I guess obviously there's always exceptions to the rule. I think nurture is more powerful in the bigger picture, longer run. How we're raised tends to have more of an influence, but there's always exceptions. Do you know what I mean? And the exceptions just paint, for me, I was going, well, okay, I've got to hold some of my beliefs a bit more lightly.
Yeah, and it was so funny with my discussion with James Fallon. Dr. Fallon said, "There's not a clinician in the world who wants to hear that you can't change somebody," and that's and he's like, but the proof in the pudding is in these situations. I've yet to come across somebody who was changed by intervention.
Yeah, right. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
I have to find someone to interview who takes exception to that one and sees the difference.
Yeah. I guess I attract the people in my life that want to change, and so therefore it validates my own truth. So I don't work with, there's that whole idea that you attract what you see and experience what you believe. So I'm not saying what Dr. Fallon's not true, but that's his lens, and it sounds really, really interesting. I just end up attracting people that want to change. And so my experience is they change, and therefore I can maybe have a misplaced worldview that, yeah, all people can change. And that's probably, from what I'm hearing you saying, that's not necessarily true. Yeah.
It's so interesting. I think what you said before, though, holding your beliefs a little bit less tightly in these circumstances, and the complexity of human behavior is probably the best way.
Yeah.
So let's change tunes, and I don't think much of a changing of tunes, though, because you mentioned somatic experiencing in pairing with Gestalt therapy. So I'd love to explore that. And so starting off, for those who have never heard of somatic experiencing in their life, what is it, and how did you come across it?
I'll start with how I came across it. It's basically friends, therapists that I know. They started studying the first somatic experiencing training that was provided in Australia. I don't know when it was, maybe 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer. They did the training, they told me about it, and it sounded really good. And I thought, well, yeah, I'd like to do that, because somatic experiencing basically is a trauma based therapy. And it's got a particular way as somatic, and means the body. So it's essentially working more with the felt sense and the nervous system in the body around working with trauma, rather less to do with the head, what we're thinking and feeling. That's still part of it from a head center point of view, but essentially it's more working with trauma that's embedded within in our physicality. And that's, somatic experiencing says that trauma is more to do with the nervous system than the memory, because traditionally it was all about, you go back to the event, talk about the event, have some sort of cathartic kind of experience, which for some people definitely that has worked, but for the majority it doesn't. It just ends up re-traumatizing. So somatic experiencing is about I'm trying to find the right word. It's an approach. Instead of going through the story, it's going through the body as a means, in a gentle means of releasing traumatic experiences that are held in the body.
What is where did it come about? Who formalized this approach and? Yeah,
right. So it was developed by Peter Levine. He's one of the sort of luminaries of the trauma field. Sorry. And so I think it's about 40 years ago. So basically, to give a bit of background, and I'm probably not relaying this completely, but I know you'll get the sense of it. He essentially used to study animals. I can't remember what that apology is, but he had some things that his area of interest was in animal studies. And he basically, what he noticed was that animals don't get traumatized. Animals in the wild, animals in zoos and such like, held in captivity, show symptoms of trauma, but animals in the wild don't. And so he was curious about that, because he obviously recognized that as humans, we basically got the same physiology as animals, yet a lot of us carry a lot of trauma. And so what he noticed was in his study was that, like say you're on the Serengeti in Africa, and you've got all the zebras, wildebeests, antelopes, etc. They're all basically being predated by the big cats, and wild dogs and hyenas. So that dynamic is happening all the time, where you've got the carnivores chasing the herbivores, right? And so you'd think that to a human being to be under the threat of being another animal's meal is quite stressful. And it was traumatizing to be chased by a big lion and then almost eaten, or cheetah, whatever it is, then and not be traumatized by it. You think, no, that's, and what he notices is that doesn't happen in animals. So he said, well, why doesn't that happen in animals? And they have a process of releasing, they have all the same nervous system response, high adrenaline spike. There's a flight and fight, situation where the big cats, so to speak, they're in the fight response because they're going to get something. And then the antelopes, etc., they're in a flight response because they're trying to run away from this threat. And so when that happens, is a big injection of energy in their bodies to help them run away, right? But when they avoid the big cat, which they invariably do, they have to then get rid of all that energy in the body and in their bodies, and they release it through various methods. And so what Peter Levine noticed, well, then in mammals, their nervous system is exactly the same as our nervous systems, as humans' nervous systems. And so he was curious around, well, if they can release trauma, why aren't we releasing trauma? Okay, we're not getting predated every day, but we're having some people having similar traumatic experiences where their nervous system is highly activated. They're going to fight-flight situations, and they have a flood of energy to help cope with that situation or not, but they end up being traumatized by it. And so why is that? And so he developed a method to help people release the energy that's contributes to traumatic symptoms in the body. Did that make sense, Emil?
That makes perfect sense for me. It's really, it's mind-blowing, really. Imagine we have our hyenas and we have our cheetahs and lions, but they're all behind a computer screen or in our telephones or in, walking across the road from us. It's
right.
Because a lot of people who feel, there might be people watching this who are at work and their hyena is in the boss's office, and they're kind of like, okay, well, they're kind of on high gear. But you said before, earlier in our discussion, you wouldn't necessarily go and confront, or you kind of like just agree with your bosses and not kind of go against. Right. In just day-to-day life, we have a stressful or traumatizing experiences that really reorient how we see the world. But let's take a step back and define trauma. What's the best conception that you've come across in terms of identifying and defining trauma?
For me, trauma is when we experience an event that's completely overwhelming. Normally, we have our normal capacities that we can deal with a certain amount of stress. Let's just use the word stress. We're able to deal with it on a day-to-day basis, and it doesn't. Sure, we might have some symptoms if it's excessive, but usually we can cope with that. But in a traumatic situation, like a car accident, an assault, rape, early childhood abuse, neglect type thing, the nervous system is completely overwhelmed. And so basically our normal coping strategies don't cope with this overwhelming feelings that usually flood the system of like fear, helplessness, that type of thing. Those are the main feelings. And so that basically ruptures our normal coping capacity, our normal ability to handle and tolerate those feelings. And so if that is not worked through, if you like, that traumatic event, and there's no healing involved, the energy that's generated in the system is held in the system and then manifests as various kind of symptoms. The way I look at it is that if I use my hands, if my hands represent the normal ebb and flow of my emotional day like this, so it's just going in and out. I might have a stressful part of the day, then I relax and something else happens. So that, a normal nervous system sort of resonates like that, or you could say it's like this, but I'm just using this way. So I'm coping. It's not outside of my coping capacity. When there's a traumatic situation where something happens that is really overwhelming, basically it goes from this to right out here. So that's what gets flooded, a whole bunch of energy from in our instinctual systems, adrenal systems, etc., flood our system because it's so overwhelming. And that energy, if it doesn't release back out because it's held within, it's within our body, in our system, if that energy is not released in some form, it's got to go somewhere. And so usually, and this is the issue with and what the research shows, or what Peter Levine observed and other trauma luminaries have observed, is that we hold that in. We override our natural ability to release excessive emotional, instinctual energies that's in the body type thing. I'll give you an example with an animal type thing. I used to have chickens, and and with chickens, you sort of have to clip the end of their wings, otherwise they can fly out of the coop. They're like fingernails. They don't feel anything, so you just cut in the edges off the wings, the ends off the wings, and then that stops them. It reduces their ability to fly, right? So I had to do this with a couple of my chickens, and so what happens is I go in there, and all of a sudden, excuse me, I'm the predator, right? I'm the one that's after that chicken. I'm the fox or whatever it is. But to that chicken, I'm enemy number one. So first thing it does, it runs off, right, and goes into a flight response. And then it realizes it can't get away, it freezes, and it just sits there. And then I'm able to pick it up and then clip its wings. But what I noticed was, so that chicken went through a trauma process. It went through an overwhelming process of where it was, tried to run away, that didn't work, and then it went into a freeze response. So then when I clipped its wings, put it down, and what the chicken did was just then ruffle its feathers. It allowed itself to release the adrenaline. It just, if you know, this happens, I've done it numerous times. It releases the energy by ruffling its feathers, shaking a little bit, and then it just goes on its merry way. And that's what we as humans stop ourselves from doing, is that our natural body's response is that when we have a traumatic event, most of the time, that if we allow the energy to dissipate and move in various ways, then that energy has somewhere to go. It's not held in the body, but our mind, excuse me, I'm drinking water. But our mind overrides it. And we just, through shame or embarrassment or whatever, or I've just got to get on with it. I'm not going to, override the difficult feelings. And so that doesn't allow the natural process of discharge, energetic discharge to occur. And so then, as I said, we hold it in the body, and then the body has to do something with that energy, and it gets locked into various parts. And so it's never the same for everybody. It's always quite unique. So for some people, it might start manifesting as mental health challenges, anxiety, depression. Others that have physiological traumatic responses like fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, aches and pains in body, migraines. These can, could be other causes, of course, but these can also be symptoms of trauma and unreleased and unprocessed traumatic events. And so the aim with SE is to sort of work with that and facilitate the release process to allow that energy to move out of the system through a natural process. And then as that happens, the traumatic symptoms abate and stop. And that's been my experience.
As a thought exercise, if somebody were a bit psychopathic and wanted to, when the chicken is in the middle of shaking itself off, wanted to just kind of try to startle the chicken again and then again and again, so that it interfered with that response.
Yeah, right.
The chicken would generally become traumatized. Is there any evidence of that in the?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if anybody's actually been sadistic enough to do that, but you just basically describe what can happen to humans in chronic trauma. You can have single incident trauma, and then there's chronic trauma. And what you just described was chronic trauma, where it's a repeated pattern of not, in being especially like in early childhood, say repeated abuse, that type of thing, or repeated raping or family violence, that sort of thing, where you have repeated events. It becomes chronic and ongoing. Then the trauma symptoms get even, more embedded, and it takes obviously more work and time to release and be with those and heal from those events.
Yeah, I think there's a good point there.
Whether that happens with animals, I don't really know. I haven't, yeah, I haven't read about anything like that. But you know, like I did mention zoos. So like I remember once going to Vancouver Zoo and seeing a polar bear in there, and it was completely traumatized. It was actually, I felt like it was insane. It was just swaying from side to side. You know, it was just, yeah, it was a sad thing to see in my book. And so that's what, you know, not that I don't know much information, but that's what Peter Levine observed is animals held in captivity generally are more traumatized because for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I on that point, I've heard it said that orcas that are in captivity, their fins begin to, the dorsal fin.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Whereas in the
Yeah.
wild, it's not like that, and that's a sign of
Yeah.
stress, apparently.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they're really intelligent animals, social, intelligent, and so you're putting them in a tiny environment to what they're compared to used to. That, yeah, it's like, well, how would you like to be put in a cage? And you know, it's only got a few feet. Lockdown's proven how difficult it is to, when you know you're taking out your usual life and then you're just in an enclosed space. That, you know, for some people, whether it's traumatizing, that's another thing, but it's definitely has an impact. People cope, but over a period of time, if it was sustained for a long period of time, you'd have a lot of trauma on our hands because it's not natural. It's not what we were born or inclined to do, type thing.
And sadly, we have been in lockdowns for a significant part of last year, over 100 days, I think it was,
Right.
of lockdown, and now we're onto our fifth lockdown. From an anecdotal point of view, you know, you see the effect that this has on children who aren't able to go to school and socialize, and even just adults who just want to go out there and exercise, or you know, and that's not, for example, you know, going outside, getting vitamin D, going for walks, getting exercise, doing that sort of stuff is protective against any type of illness, so to speak, in terms of you building your immune system and that sort of stuff, and socializing with people and having social engagements. And when that's taken away, the question is, you know, what's the utility of that? And that goes into a separate discussion around the utility of lockdowns in terms of mental health and that sort of stuff, which I must get somebody to speak with on that.
Be interesting. Yeah.
From an anecdotal point of view, I've seen the devastation of lockdowns from a mental, in terms of addiction and increased alcohol and drug use and that sort of stuff. It's really hard.
Sure, definitely, 100%.
I want to pick up on your use of the word energy. And for the longest time, when I came across somatic experiencing, I had trouble because I'm quite analytical. I want to think into these definitions and look at the science behind that. And a word like energy, like energy that's stored in your body, or releasing energy, and that's
right.
Okay. It might be that way inclined. Can you give a bit of a background on what somatic experience means when they talk about energy release and locking?
Well, I suppose it's when I use the word energy, it's kind of I'm talking about the life force energy in us type thing, and how that gets activated, like an instinctual. Usually, the life force energy is you could say is linked to the instinctual systems of our body. So the survival. I'm talking about the survival drive here, and the high amounts of energy that are associated with that. So when in stressful or highly traumatizing situations, then a part of the nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, gets activated, and that puts in a lot of energy into the body. And the sympathetic system is to do with the fight and flight response. So people are familiar with, adrenaline, the stress hormone, cortisol, that type of thing. Those hormones flood the body, so we have access to this large amount of nervous instinctual energy to help us deal with the situation at hand. So if you're walking down say at night time, and you're walking down, it's dark, and you're walking down an alleyway, and you see another person coming towards you, then your nervous system can possibly perceive that as a threat, and it's all out of awareness. And so then you're in response to that, then our bodies then start producing adrenaline, cortisol, in this sort of fight, flight readiness in case there's a threat there, right? And so in trauma situations, and that might be a mild level, it could be varying from person to person. In that alleyway situation, that could be a lot of energy, or it could be, a small amount. It depends, But in a traumatic situation, a trauma-inducing situation, that amount of energy can be exponentially large, massive amount of energy. And and so, like with what they say in physics, that energy has to go somewhere. There's nowhere for it to go and flow. Then it has to, and it's not released in some form, then it's going to get stuck somewhere, basically. And for us as human beings and animals in the mammal world, the way we release those energy is through heat in the body, or shaking, or various kinds of physical sensations in the body. It's one way of releasing. But if we override that and just say, I'm okay, there's nothing to worry about, or we try and toughen up, or because we have to, because that's what's needed, or it's repeated and ongoing, like you described earlier, then, and there's no way that the body can come back down into a state of rest and equilibrium, so to speak. In those chronic situations, the nervous system is always constantly on and charged up, and so they end up at a higher level, and so then that has its own symptoms as a result. But yeah, basically, in short, I'm describing energy as the instinctual life force that gets activated and elevated in certain threat situations, or even stressful situations.
It's so fascinating on how quickly this system responds to stress. The instinctual system, doing a bit of digging and writing about it, I've just recently had a paper published called The Body's Ingenious Response to Threat. And it's an editorial, so it's a one-pager where we talk about how the brain picks up stimuli in the environment 350 to 400 times quicker than our conscious awareness of that threat even being there. A really interesting example of that comes across from the neuroscientists and neuropsychotherapist story, Dan Siegel. He talks about a hike that he had with his son. He was walking across the trail and he just stopped his son from walking anymore, but he had no idea why he stopped. And so he looks around and he can't see anything until he looks down at the path, and towards the side of the path there's a rattlesnake. And rattlesnakes ordinarily they camouflage into their environment, so it's easy to miss. But his body was able to pick up and consider that threat even before he was aware that there was a threat there. And one of the ways that I consider that with my clients is I ask them to put their hands in front of them and then kind of move all the way around until they can't see their hands anymore. And then you can see how much their hands open up before they're aware that, okay, I can't see anything. But their brain is constantly processing all that information at that time, and that happens in a thousandth of a second. To put it in context, that's as quick as it takes a housefly's wings to flap just one time.
Yeah, wow.
You've got the scanning, the arrest and orient system, that the stress response where you stop and you kind of scan the environment. It's already in full gear. So I think it's really important because you talked about the fight-flight response, and you've mentioned the freeze response. Can you give us a bit of a sense on one thing that stood with me as a bit of a sidestep when you explained to me, a while ago, how fight happens from the waist up and how flight happens from the waist down? That's just something that I've kept with me for a significant period of time. Can you kind of talk about the different body-based symptoms for fight, flight, freeze, and fall? Can you define them and kind of consider those?
Yeah, sure. So with the freeze response, again, it's another instinctual response to a danger or threat situation. So, like when you see, sometimes you may have seen a cat playing with a mouse, and then a mouse, just playing with it, not killing it, and stuff like that. And one of the mouse's response, it tries to run away at first, might try to fight, but it tends to try to run away at first. But then it gets to a point where sometimes the energy, when I talked about the sympathetic, the adrenals and the cortisol and that high energy spike of and the sense of overwhelm happens. When that gets to a certain point, it can vary from person to person. It's called the ventral the dorsal brake. It's like a braking system in the nervous system goes, this is too much, and I'm just going to put you in a freeze response, because that's another survival mechanism to happen. So just basically shuts the whole system down. We just stay literally in a freeze response. It's like a playing dead, feigning death type response in extreme circumstances, and it does work for some animals. They go into a freeze response, and what happens is the neurobiology of it is that the predator, the big cat, for example, when it sees, say, an animal, whatever it is, it's chased and is in a freeze response, its fight response, its sympathetic system slows down. And so when it slows down, it might lose interest for a moment. And so that might be a window of opportunity for the animal that's frozen to escape. And so in humans, we have that same possibility of freezing, and which generally happens for a lot of people. They can freeze in a traumatizing situation. Say they're in a fight scenario or something, and then they freeze, I think, because it's too much for their body, and so the body's instinctual response is to freeze. And this is not a conscious decision, and that's the thing in sort of when working in trauma is the message that I convey to people is that freeze is not in your, like you said, it happens. You're not thinking about it. It just happens. It's an automatic instinctual response to a situation, because your body has assessed that might be your best way of coping with the threat situation. Because if you fight or run away, you might get killed. So freezing offers another survival mechanism to help cope with the situation and lessen the possible injury or death in its most extreme version, right? So we definitely have that. It's the oldest part of our nervous system that's able to do that. So like I said, people can go into a freeze situation. Like, for example, a common example is you go to an interview, people get anxious, and that anxiety might start elevating, getting worse, and then they can freeze. They can't say anything, just kind of feel like they're a deer in headlights type thing. That's what I mean by freeze. So what was you asked a bunch of questions. Then you said a fawning response. Well, basically, fawning is more of an adaptive human thing. People have added it to fight, flight, freeze, and then fawn. It's more like how to appease and please the person that you're with. It's more, my understanding of it, it's more of a relational kind of process where people are with abusers type thing, or violent parents or violent partners or whatever it is. And so they've learned and adapted to have more of a pleasing, fawning type way of coping with their. So it's still a shutdown of their nervous system, where they're having to acquiesce and be subservient and stuff like that. But again, to use Gestalt terms, it's a creative adjustment to the context that they're in. It helps. It's an adaptive process to help them survive. And that's basically all there is. The fight, flight, freeze, fawn process is processes that we have that help us survive threat and violent, dangerous situations.
It's an interesting one, because I often talk about the fight, flight, freeze fall, and then the fawn response.
Fall. Oh, okay. I've heard that one. Okay.
Yeah, okay. So the 5 Fs, as I kind of consider it,
Ah, okay. Yeah.
based on the fall response, is just categorizing what you've already mentioned around the body folding in on itself, preserving energy, and trying to, so you've already explained what it is. It's just a different terminology for it. Whereas a freeze response is more of a to stop, to camouflage, and you kind of see the nervous system activated from the tip of your head to the tip of your feet, where your body just freezes all up, and you kind of feel like you want to run or fight, but you don't know how to do it, so your body kind of freezes up. The fall response is that step further, where I think you mentioned and we'll get into the vagus nerve very soon, but the dorsal vagal system, where the body completely shuts down and tries to preserve energy. I don't seem to see that in the freeze response as much as I see it in when the body folds in fetal position and kids
right
trying to go into. Do you kind of differentiate between those two, or not?
I mean, it makes sense what you're saying. I don't myself, but yeah, it makes complete sense of what you're saying. So yeah, I think it's I think it's just the way you've described it is more of a differentiation of the same part of the nervous system that's activated in the freeze, as you said, the dorsal vagal. So it's the same nervous part of the autonomic nervous system that's in play, that then results in different responses. So as you say, it can be a fall response or a freeze response or a fawn response. They're all kind of dorsal vagal. The way I'm thinking about it, they're all part of that part of the nervous system. So probably for your viewers, it's probably good to have a bit of a definition of. So you like from somatic experiencing, big chunk of a lot of trauma work that people do these days with their different methodologies. It's called Polyvagal theory, and that's what has contributed to a significant, in my opinion, a significant change in how therapy in general and awareness has grown through this theory of to work with trauma in really effective ways, especially body-based ones anyway. So Polyvagal theory was postulated by a chap called Stephen Porges, and his book is pretty thick and very academic, so I wouldn't recommend it, but there's definitely other versions around that make it more simple for anybody who wants to have a read about it. But basically it's talking about the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system can be broken into firstly, it can be broken into two branches. Is the sympathetic system, which we've talked about a little bit, and then its opposite is the parasympathetic system. And the parasympathetic system can then be divided into two elements. You've got which is part of the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve has the ventral vagal, and then there's also another element to it. It's called the dorsal vagal, and it's all related to where they are in relationship to the body. And the autonomic nervous system in this polyvagal theory pretty much controls nearly all aspects of our biology in a sense. So like the sympathetic system is, when that's online, is you working with the muscles, that impacts the eyes, the breathing, the heart. So everything of the polyvagal system impacts all our organs inside our body, and also impacts on our muscular system, and basically how we relate and socialize with people. So, and it's an evolutionary model in the sense of that the dorsal vagal is the oldest part of our system. I think it's like started developing in animals 800 million years ago. And that's basically the freeze response, when back then, and to some degree more primitive animals now, when they encounter another animal similar, maybe in the same species or a threat, they just hold still, right? And so that obviously didn't work as we got more complicated and more evolved. Just staying still usually meant that you were going to get eaten. So then over a period of time, hundreds of millions of years, about 500 million years ago from memory, the sympathetic system evolved in animals and in mammals, and more in reptiles, I suppose, developed in them. And that was all about the fight flight. So if something got close to you, it wasn't one of your own, you either swam off, ran off, or you'd fight back bite or do whatever you needed to do to escape.
Let's just
Then,
put in context just for a second. 500
sure.
years ago was before there were even trees.
Okay.
So this
All
is,
right. Okay.
and 300 million years ago was when, yeah, well, 250 million years ago was around the time of the first dinosaurs and bees and houseflies. So this is a system that's so ingrained within the human, the biology of our development that's been
Yeah.
around since before we've seen trees. You had shrubs.
Yeah, because it's in the oceans, so it developed in the oceans. Animals in the oceans. Yeah, so really primitive. I can't remember the names of the various types of creatures, but yeah, I'm only repeating what I've heard and read.
I think it's really important, yeah, because we can get lost and bogged down in like hundreds of millions of years. But like if we say, okay, well, this has been around since before we can even imagine.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, right. So we can say the first system is very, very old. Then the second system is really old, and then the next system, the ventral vagal system, is more evolved with the onset of mammals, and so that is about 200 million years old, I think. And so with mammals, what happened with mammals, what was different from other species, was that they learned to have more familial group herd, like herds, sort of families, and where the mammals looked after their young. And so because of that evolutionary step, you had to remove the fight response, in a sense, because most animals up to that point weren't very friendly with each other. They would either attack them or eat them. So to have families or to live in a herd, you've got to have a system, in a sense, where you can tolerate and be around other animals of your same species. So the ventral system evolved in animals, so it allowed the parents, so to speak, to raise their offspring, and all allowed animals to be in large herds in their own species, and without the idea that they're going to eat them or attack them or whatever it is. And so that obviously developed in humans to a higher degree, in the sense the ventral system is to do with social engagement, and is pretty much more related to the face and how, because we're so face orientated. And so we read information, all that, as you were saying back before, about that split second of how we interpret our environment. Humans do that a lot through the face. And so we read each other's face. And so how the face would send messages to our nervous system, whether that person's friendly or not. And that's the first thing. So if you meet a stranger on the road, the first system that gets activated is the ventral vagal system. So you're checking out, if this person comes at you with a smile, their eyes are reflecting that smile, they've got eye contact, they're more animated in their face, and they've got a general greeting. That's the ventral vagal system that's in play. And then that you see that, or you're doing that, and that has the same effect on them, then you know that other person's not a threat. Then take it to the next level. It's like I said, if somebody comes along to you with a hoodie on and you can't see their eyes and their face is more flat, more expressionless, that then can activate the sympathetic system, which then readies you for the fight-flight response. And that's the next level type thing. And then then you do get into a fight-flight situation and you realize you're going to get overwhelmed by this person. They're bigger than you, stronger than you, whatever it is, you can't escape. Then you might go into the oldest part of this evolutionary process and freeze, because that's your best survival chance. In that, might not, but it's your better one than fighting back or trying to run, because then you definitely get hurt more, like I said before. Yeah, I think that's given a bit of a summary.
I think you gave an excellent summary on the development of these systems and considering how they affect each of our responses in terms of fight, flight, freeze. Let's consider what ventral and dorsal vagal mean, because up until relatively recently, in the grand scheme of things, I had never heard the system. So what is the vagus nerve? Where does it come from? And what is the ventral vagal? What is the dorsal vagal?
All right. Okay. Now you've got my biology going now. So basically, the vagal nerve is Latin for vagare, I think it is. So it's like vagabond. It means it means the wanderer. So it's the longest nerve in the body, and I think it starts in the back of the head, and then it's distributed through either the vagus nerve. I think it's dorsal, because the dorsal sits at the back, more at the back, and the ventral vagal is more at the front. So I think that's why they've named it dorsal and ventral. But this basically, so the ventral vagal then basically controls, well, part of its functioning is, like I was saying, it's like our facial expression, and also helps control the regulation of the breathing and heart rate. And so it's generally situated and governs from a heart diaphragm, above a diaphragm and above, whereas a dorsal vagal controls the organs and the viscera below the diaphragm, and is its healthy functioning is around digestion, that type of thing.
The dorsal,
and
is that like a dorsal fin, like at the back of the
Yeah. Dorsal means the back. So if you think of it, that's how I envision it. So like the dorsal fin, yeah. So I think it's just where it's located. Yeah. So it's more at the back. So if the dorsal is here, the ventral's in front, where they start in the brain.
That makes sense. So ventral, it's so weird because it is biology.
I could have got that wrong, but yeah, like it's something like that anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And what I found was really interesting. I did a bit of digging into the parasympathetic nervous system response, and what we often see is that the vagus nerve comes straight out of the brainstem, that very primitive part that you were describing, and it branches out to the rest of our kind of body in terms of torso. But then you've also got the facial nerve, which is also one of the cranial nerves that regulate the parasympathetic nervous system. And then you've got the oculomotor nerve, which is the one that controls the motor neurons behind our eyes, which is also a cranial nerve that regulates the parasympathetic nervous system. And it's so
right.
I think there might be another one that I might be missing out on, but these three you can like work in tandem with different strategies, isn't it? Where it's kind of like eye movement strategies, or things like regulating the facial muscles, and also the body-based strategies, which I want to get into soon. But in terms of the parasympathetic nervous system, you mentioned that that's the system that calms the body down when it's feeling really activated, and the sympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that gets the body ready for action. And they all come out from the autonomic nervous system, which is basically that part of the nervous system which regulates all our heart breathing, heart blood pressure, all that sort of stuff that we're not in control of. And they come out of the peripheral nervous system, which is regulated by the nerves throughout our body.
Yeah.
And that's comes out from the nervous system, which is basically brain, spinal cord.
Yeah, the central nervous system,
So you've got the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, which I just wanted to break that down, because it's really, we get bogged down in these details on, we might understand the autonomic nervous system or parasympathetic, but then where does this all fit? What's the Gestalt, to use your term?
You've asked a question I can't answer. It sounds like you have more knowledge than me, so maybe you could talk to the viewers about that. I don't know I don't know exactly what the relationship is 100% between the autonomic nervous system, as you say, and the peripheral, and then the central nervous system. How they all interact, that's kind of like not in my pay grade at the moment.
Well, I think you can speak to the practical elements of these, though, because along the way you've taught me so many different strategies around working with the nervous system, and this all fits within it. So I'd like to just go into that one, because you might not have the at the moment you might not be conceptualizing it in that way, but this is what you're doing, and your practical experience of it is really, I think it's really useful for our listeners to hear. So tell us about, how do you work with the nervous system? And
I see. Right. Okay.
Regulate that.
So basically, in somatic experiencing, you want to have, when you're working with trauma, or any situation with any of the clients I work with, it's sort of your first port of call for me is engaging somebody with their ventral vagal system. So their capacity to be resourced, feeling that they have the ability to access their resourcing abilities to stay, to be calmer, to feel engaged, and not feel like they have to run away or fight or whatever, or feel like they're in a free situation. So to engage this part of the social engagement, let's just call it the social engagement system, because that's what keeps us calm, type thing. And the way to do that is like what we're doing now, is just having a conversation. So our ventral vagal system, I might have been nervous a little bit at the beginning, but I don't feel any nerves right now. I feel quite relaxed, and I feel engaged with you. And, we're just having this to and fro sort of conversation. So our ventral vagal system, I would say, is pretty much online. And so I feel okay. And so from a therapy point of view, I would be like working on that as well. And so and hobbies, interests, hobbies, what makes you feel good, all those things are going to be activating the ventral vagal system to help you feel regulated, and not as opposed to dysregulated, which can happen in the dorsal vagal or the sympathetic system. But even having said that, though, the sympathetic system, it's still got its healthy elements. It's not all about, stress, adrenaline and cortisol. You just going for a walk is going to, and doing exercise is going to activate your sympathetic system. Having a good belly laugh, being joyful is part of the sympathetic system, right? So, but it's still in sync. It's like still in sync with the ventral system that has a more relaxed tone. So in trauma work, it's really important from an SE perspective. It's really important that the person I'm working with has good resources. So that'd be the first port of call, is building up resources and capacity to be able to be a bit more regulated. And for some individuals who are highly traumatized, that's not necessarily an easy thing. So there could be simple techniques around building up, sort of using your senses, maybe looking around the room, seeing something nice, like maybe looking out the window, they like the look of a tree, or, this is where there's a side issue where pet-assisted therapy is really useful, because they bring lots of resources. So people can have their own pets. So just thinking about their pet, going for a walk with their pet, whatever it's cat, dog, etc. That just the memory of it is a resource type thing. So there's that's the first part. Then you get into the point where if you're going to start working with the trauma, then from a somatic experiencing point of view, you do it a little bit at a time. It's not about diving right into the acid pit, so to speak. It's more about dipping your toe into a stream and seeing what that feels like and working with that. And then if that brings some sort of dysregulation, then you come back to the resourcing, and there's other techniques, simple techniques around looking around the room, feeling your feet on the ground, that type of thing. So bringing in all the senses, what you hear, what maybe sometimes what you smell even, because they activate a particular part of the brain that helps calm the nervous system. Or you change the subject and talk about something completely different, so you get back into the ventral vagal social engagement system.
That's so interesting. All right, so it smacks of mindfulness type strategies. Are you kind of considering the here and now, like grounding yourself to build up those resources? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, sure. You're exactly right. Mindfulness, the way in mindfulness-based approaches, they're doing it. It's all about in the moment, sort of what are you experiencing in the here and now. So that's with somatic experiencing. What you're experiencing right now, and then cultivating, particularly if it's a difficult feeling, cultivating your people's capacity to stay with that feeling in a mindful way. So the more mindful you are with something, the more you put a little bit of distance between what you're experiencing, especially if it's an uncomfortable feeling. So if you describe something, so I'm feeling anxiety, for example, and I start describing that anxiety. I'm feeling like this fluttering sort of tension in my belly, particularly around my belly button, it's really tight around there. And then I'm noticing my heart's, racing more. I can feel it sort of pounding a little bit in my chest. I'm starting to get a bit of heat, a bit sweaty. I can notice some sweaty. So I'm describing some common symptoms or, experiences of anxiety. I'll change it to experiences of anxiety. And then, so by doing that, I'm in the act of describing in a mindful way helps to be with that feeling, because you're not completely immersed in it. You're like looking at it, describing it. And so that engages a part of the frontal cortex in the brain that's able to observe these feelings and sensations and your experience. And so that has a regulatory sort of process, and also cultivates capacity to stay with a difficult feeling. Does that make sense?
That makes good sense. So in these situations, it's kind of like you can't think yourself out of this anxiety, so to speak. I mean, some people might try to bury it, but saying something like, "Oh, you shouldn't feel anxious. There's nothing to feel anxious about," or whatever. This does nothing to negate those, or does it do something to negate those kind of physical sensations?
Well, no, it's sort of, and that's the point I think I was making earlier around how we sort of reject feelings and traumatic feelings because of those very kind of thought process that I shouldn't be feeling this, or I should be feeling something else. That has a rejecting quality to the experience. Sure, it's understandable. We're wired to wanting to feel good and not feel bad, right? But that doesn't actually work. In Gestalt, it'll say what you resist persists. So the more you resist difficult feelings, the more they're going to stay around. And the resistance that you give to a particular feeling fuels that feeling, because your resistance is using part of your life force, if you like, and then that's just fueling, adding petrol to the fire, if you like. And so it basically just keeps it in place, or even inflames it so it feels more. So the fear of the fear, or the fear of the anxiety increases the fear. So the more you befriend fear or befriend anxiety, you reduce the anxiety or reduce the fear. And knowing that at some point it will pass, and that we can change, like I said, you can change your experience or help to calm down your experience or tolerate your experience by in somatic experiencing, we use resourcing. So if somebody's really feeling like a feeling's too much, like anxiety, we sort of move to the side, and then talk about a resource and say, change the topic, and then let their nervous system calm down. And then they might go and dip their toe back in whatever the challenging feeling is, or the story, or the traumatic event. And then, so it's like that. That's pretty much what SE does. It has this, the process is going, it's called, the technical term is systematic desensitization. So it's you systematically just go in a little bit, feel what needs to be felt, learn to tolerate it, be with it, see if there's some discharge in that process, which is the Yahoo moment in somatic experiencing, and then bring them back out, resource them, and feel back more grounded, more capable of coping. They still may feel a difficult feeling, but it's hopefully, and generally, it's sort of a lower intensity. And then once they're ready, then you go back in again, systematically you go back in. So it's quite a guided process. It's not a free-flowing process. Somatic experience is quite guided in that way to help support the client's nervous system to regulate. See, like our nervous system right now probably is regulating like this. One moment I'm kind of listening to you, even though I'm talking, my nervous system might be more sympathetically activated because I'm more engaged right now, even though the ventral system's here, like I said before. But then when I'm listening, when you start talking, my nervous system will slow down a little bit and be a bit more passive. And I'm in this is how I experience it, a bit more passive and listening. I'm still engaged, but then you finish, you ask a question. You might ask a question like you did before, and I didn't know the answer, and I got a bit, but then so I got a bit of a charge in it, and then kind of like it was fine. I I don't have any issue with and I don't know something, so it was okay. It makes me laugh. So so that, you know, I was able to have a laugh about that in myself. So that's my ventral system. So that's a natural flow. That basically, along with that, that's a natural flow. People with trauma or significant challenges with their emotions and feelings are very dysregulated all the time. Their nervous system is outside of this natural flow. They tend to be up here, like anxiety, they're always on, the switch is always on, or if they're depressed, the switch is always off, type thing. Does that make sense? And so the SE approach is around bringing the anxiety down and learning to bring it down. And then with depressed people, if you like, or shame or whatever it is they're experiencing that's activated the dorsal vagal, is to bring their energy in and up so that they can start feeling whatever there needs to be felt.
So comparing that type of work, and us clinicians and researchers have the sense of a bottom-up processing. You're working with the body and then processing upwards to the mind to make sense of it after you've already processed it in the body, versus like a top-down approach, which is kind of like using the mind to try to change the body, whereas things like cognitive therapies kind of fall into that camp. And then you have cognitive behavior therapies, which try to integrate some elements of, you know, body-based focusing and cognitive processing. And then you have more like the somatic therapy that you're describing, which is kind of like, let's focus on the body. And then if you make sense of it after, then that's when the mind kicks in. It's kind of like after the fact. It's kind of like a process that isn't forced. It's almost like at the bequest of the person who's trying to process an issue. So I guess my question lies within those who might not have a training in, you know, body-based therapies and tend to kind of fall back on CBT or cognitive-based therapies. What are some really practical strategies that they can do to not just jump into the trauma or jump into
right.
anxiety? Yeah.
Sure. So I mean, basically, you're just asking a question. And so they're talking about, say, the CBT-based approach, or, you know, say talking about a particular belief pattern that they formed, and, you know, and it's sort of, and then you, like for me, it's not like the process, and that's why I probably like Gestalt. I merged Gestalt and SE. It's not like you dismiss, and SE doesn't dismiss how you make meaning out of things. It just pays less attention to it. So basically, if you ask somebody of how they have a particular belief, or working with their inner critic or something like that, yeah, I mean, a body-based question is, well, how does that impact you? Where do you feel that in your body? So, you know, you're noticing any particular sensations in there, and so you can give a menu, you know, like I'll give some example like I did with the anxiety. Sometimes I feel, when I feel anxious, I feel you know, tense in my belly. What are you experiencing? Because say they're talking about anxiety, if they've got some anxiety about a belief system. So you just bring in their awareness and attention. It's just basically asking a question about what's actually happening in the body. It's not rocket science. It's more being comfortable and trusting the process. So the reason I'm more inclined to go through the body, because to me it seems more of, it's not dismissing the head and what the mind and thoughts and cognitions have to say. It's more that the body has a different way of relating to the therapeutic process. And sometimes, as I said before, the body is what releases the energy that's locked in the nervous energy that's locked in the body. And so it's just basically bringing some inquiry, to answer your question in short, bringing some inquiry in your questioning what's actually happening physically. How would you describe that? Is it okay to stay with that? And then, because you're bringing more of a total, so if I'm use Gestalt, you're bringing more of a total curiosity to the person's experience. If you're just dealing with the head and the behaviors, then you're not bringing the total experience in, because you could be thinking something and your body's going through another kind of process. It has its own intelligence, and so we can override in our head. There's nothing wrong. All therapies have some form of CBT in them. You have to, because they're all interlinked. So because basically the biology is that from the polyvagal system, 80% of the nerves from the polyvagal system, the vagus nerve, go from the body to the head, right? And then only 20% of that goes back into the body. So our minds are getting all this information from the body, and then it makes meaning out of that body. And usually you make meaning based on your history, etc., and what you've learned. So the idea is that true? You could have beliefs about yourself, and going through the body is one way of supporting more emotional regulation as well. And so if you support better regulation in the body, your body's more regulated and relaxed, if you like, and calmer, then you're going to make a different meaning in your mind, or you reprocess something after working on your trauma. You can make a different meaning to how you see the world. The highly traumatized person perceives the world from a threat lens, and sees everybody as a danger, a potential danger, because that makes sense to them, because that's how the world was for them, especially around developmental abuse, family violence, whatever, that type of thing, victims of crime, repeated crime, etc. So they're meaning making. If you just work from a cognitive based perspective and you never resolved any of the issues that are residing in the body's still constantly sending messages to their brain of threat. And so if that's happening, it doesn't matter how much you try and rewire the thinking, if the body is still left unprocessed, then it only can take you so far. And CBT is definitely, I'm not dismissing CBT, don't get me wrong. I mean, it's totally valid process, and I certainly like elements of it for sure. It's just that I've not been trained in that way, and my lens is a bit wider, just from my own personal development as well, of the power of going through the body and utilizing the body. Well, basically, it's the totality, like I said, of the whole person: mind, body, feelings, emotions, sensations, everything. Everything should be, in my book, is valuable information to support somebody to go to help them grow them. But I'll put a caveat in there: not everybody has the capacity, or it's very hard for them to go into their body. It's very alien.
So in relation to the somatic experiencing type of things and how they differentiate, I've heard you say that there's not a massive distinction between the utility of cognitive-based therapies and body-based therapies about trying to integrate and consider how you can process things from a thought-based point of view, but also from a body-based point of view. Have I kind of captured that accurately, or is there something else you'd like to add?
No, I think that's fair enough. I mean, I will say that I don't feel like if you have some really significant trauma event or history, I don't believe, I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, this is just my perspective. Personally, obviously, I've got my own biases and lenses. I don't think a CBT, just sole CBT based approach, will do that. I think if you want to work with some trauma, then you have to work with a body-based process or some sort of other trauma-based release process like tapping or EMDR or that type of thing. So I don't think, because as you mentioned before, it's a top-down, bottom-up sort of process. Somatic Experiencing is considered a bottom-up process because it's working with the body and the more primitive parts of the brain, whereas CBT is a top-down because it's working more with the frontal part of the brain, the frontal neocortex, that type of thing, and the associated behaviors. I think that's just my personal bias. I just want to say that.
I think there is utility to understanding it that way, because there are research studies around potentially the short-term benefits of something like cognitive processing or CBT type therapies, but in terms of their utility in comparison to EMDR and body-based therapies and that sort of stuff, I think EMDR, which integrates what you're feeling and what you're seeing as well, has been considered a gold standard treatment. But then again, so is cognitive processing and cognitive-based therapies, and then you've got things like somatic experiencing or tapping. For those who are not aware of tapping, it's kind of like, you know, bringing up certain events or emotions and tapping different parts of the body while reciting those. So even though I feel anxious in my belly, I deeply accept myself. Those sort of things, I'm brushing past it really quickly. I mean, I've written a lot about tapping. I've got a paper published back in 2019. If the listeners wanted to kind of look back at tapping, I'll link it in the show notes. But in terms of very practical strategies that people who might not see the inside of a therapy room could use from a somatic based point of view, let's just say that they wake up in the middle of their night and their heart's racing, but they can't remember any dreams, and they had a really stressful day, and they're just feeling really, really hyper aroused, sort of thing, so to speak. So beating heart, really quick beating, and there's no indication that they have any heart disorders or anything like that.
Yeah.
Medical conditions. If we consider it from a stress point of view, what would you say? How would you work to that?
So you could do a couple of things there. I mean, if there's some light in the room, assuming it's not pitch black in the room, they could look around the room, and just they're a bit anxious. So when you're looking around like this, you're naturally orienting to safety, because your neck, that's what one of our functions of our biological evolutionary functions to the neck is, so we can look around. And so when you're looking around, you're scanning your environment. So you could wake up, if there's some light, you could look around the room, so you're orienting, moving your neck, and so you could start noticing what's in the room. So you could literally name, oh, that's the picture on the wall, there's the wardrobe, whatever it is, you just name it. There's the window, there's a curtain. So you're literally naming what you're seeing, type thing. And like I said before, that activates this frontal part of the brain that helps to calm down another part of the brain that's called the amygdala, that could be firing up and causing the anxiety and stress. So that's one thing you could do. Say if it's pitch black and you can't see anything, you could do sounds. You can do that anyway. If you can see, you can orient to sounds. Can you hear cars outside, or maybe your partner next to you, or something, or any kind of sound? So again, you're just naming those. So using your senses, essentially, that's one way. Another way is you could, I know this is applicable to so many situations, but you could just maybe start feeling the tactile touch of your sheets or the pillow next to you, or you could press the pillow. So you're focusing your attention on your touch of your fingers, and so squeezing the pillow, that type of thing. Or say if you've got flannelette sheets like I have at the moment, because it's cold, then they feel a bit softer compared to cotton sheets. So you're just feeling the texture, and you're really putting your attention. That's the secret, is where you're putting your attention on the touch. So even though you're doing that on your own, if I was in the therapy room, say describe that feeling of noticing that touch in your fingers. Or another way is they could, if it feels safe to do so from a body point of view, that they can just put their attention in their feet. Can they feel their feet, in under the covers, if they're under, bed sheets, that type of thing? They can move their toes, wiggle their toes, and just bringing their attention on doing that. And so again, it's sort of, the idea is you're moving your awareness to away from the anxiety or whatever it is that you're experiencing when you've woken up like that. And so all that process allows that ventral vagal system I talked about to sort of come online, and helps calm your heart. Basically, it slows your heart rate down, and then slows the breath gets more shallower, type thing. And another thing, you can take in a deep breath and let out the breath really slowly. So when we take in a breath, the in-breath it's like a little sympathetic charge type thing, because that's how it works with the heart. And then the out-breath is that engages the ventral system, so the calming element of our capacity of our nervous system. So that's why like yoga and meditation and all this have a strong emphasis on breathing, and particularly the out-breath, because the out-breath is the one thing of the autonomic nervous system, that's the one part we can control. So usually, obviously, we just breathe and we don't think about breathing, which is great. Who wants to think about breathing all day? But we have got this capacity where we can consciously take a slow breath out. So say you breathe in for 3 or 4, and then you breathe out for 5 and 6 or 7. So slowly and and more deeply, and then slowly out. That will calm your nervous system.
I think that's a really good point with the breathing. You mentioned the meditative practices. There are certain sounds that some people make in those kind of chants that can regulate certain parts of the nervous system and certain parts of the body. Have you heard of those strategies where you take a deep breath in, and when you breathe out, you make an ah sound if you're feeling something in the chest? And then the tummy one is more like an ooh sound. And if you feel from the shoulders up, you do the sound, because you can feel these vibrations differently in your body, and that can regulate these systems, these body parts a lot better. Have you noticed any particular types of breathing exercises that have worked or that have helped either yourself, people that you love, or clients that you see?
Good question. I don't usually do it with clients. I mean, usually it's just a long breath out. I don't do specific kind of breathing exercises to help regulate the system. But obviously I know of them through just from my own personal studies and etc. And I kind of do some breathing exercises for myself. I do a bit of yoga, and so I do some breathing exercises with that. And the sounds, I don't do that again. I don't do those, but sometimes I get people to make a sound if they're feeling something particular, like feeling fear. Is there a sound that sound? Does that feeling have a particular sound? So I use that way. I sort of, but I understand. It's interesting what you said about the R, U, That's basically to be a bit esoteric now. All those vowels, vowels or whatever, constants, whatever they are, they're in the sound om. Om kind of thing. So it regulates the whole body. That's why the East likes om, because it does all those things that you just said.
And I think it's really interesting. There are certain practitioners, yoga practitioners or fitness practitioners, who use those ones, and then they change it from the om to maum.
Oh, okay.
Like mum.
Right.
For some people with a great relationship with their mum, I mean, that would work, but for people who don't,
right.
About that one. So I think it's really interesting, because singers, I've spoken to singers who have these sorts of sounds that can touch them in different ways. And I think it's, opera singers, for example, you have a very, very deep kind of like the or type sounds that come out deep into your belly, and then you have the lighter sounds that come from your chest and from your throat. And oftentimes when people are singing, they're in sync with themselves, with the music around them, and they feel a lot more regulated. So I think there's a really interesting point over there. I wanted to ask you about breathing, because you've got a lot of shallow breathing when you're feeling anxious. And so let's just say you're at work, or you're in the office, or you're walking down the street, and or you're wearing a face mask, for example. Some people feel really really constricted when they're wearing a face mask, because of breathing obstruction for some people there, or anxiety and that sort of stuff. What kind of strategies have you found to soften the breathing or to lower the breathing rate so that you're not hyperventilating through your mouth, but you're breathing through your nose a little bit more.
Yeah. Again, you've got to be quite conscious. You've got to be aware. That's the hardest part when you're in sort of if you're outside and you're anxious, and your brain, because when anxiety kicks in, especially if it's bordering on panic, you're not thinking clearly because that part of the brain switches off. So it's harder, because the advice would be, if there was another person there, you would be consciously say, because I've done it before with people, that you have a conscious deep breath in and a conscious deep breath out. So it's hard when you're on your own to sort of go, oh, I'm a bit panicky. If the anxiety is not so intense and you still feel like you're cognitively aware still, so to speak, then it's basically just like I said before, it's taking a conscious breath in and slowing it down. It's basically slowing it right down. So the more you slow down, the more you're going to deactivate that part of your system that's trying to speed you up. So whether that's your fast heart, your rapid breath, rapid shallow breathing. So it's basically slowing down. So I would basically sit. But if I was in this situation, I'd tell someone to sit down, again, look around and take some conscious breaths and just let your nervous system regulate that way. And the more you practice, the thing is practice those things, then the reminders come when you end up in that situation. It's sort of one of those Pavlov dog repeat type situations, with behavioral. I mean, that's all part of the science anyway. The more you repeat a behavior, the more it becomes ingrained, a natural response when you need it and don't have to think about it.
I did a really informal experiment on myself the other day in terms of seeing how low I can bring my breathing rate. So a relaxed breathing rate is around 10 to 12 breaths a minute, and doing some breathing exercises can reduce that to half. And I remember I did the breathing exercise, which is to say, breathe in through your nose and then you breathe out while making the sound And I timed it, and in a minute I reduced my breath to 2 and a bit breaths a minute. It's really,
wow.
it's just like there's a saying, I think it's a Buddhist saying, it's not about the years that you live, but the breaths that you take.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I've heard that one. So how did you feel after doing that? That exercise then?
I was surprised because I felt like the time went really quick, even though my breathing went really slow. So I felt like the beeper, the timer went off, and I'm like, wait a minute, I haven't even taken 3 breaths yet. I think I was on the border of breathing out towards my third breath, but I hadn't quite reached there, and I felt really good. So it was really interesting, really calm.
Good in what way? Like really, relaxed, or?
I felt really relaxed. I felt really calm. I felt centered and in the moment. I feel like those were the main. And I'm going to remind myself, because I don't do that often enough. And so it's really interesting to have these little tips and tricks to have up your sleeve if you feel like you need it.
Sure. Yeah.
So spinning it around with restless legs. Okay, so how do you conceptualize and address people who are constantly restless in their legs, or their legs are always going under the table, or they feel like...
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, right, got you. So from a somatic experiencing perspective, would see, if I saw that in the therapy room, or I see that generally, it's an anxiety response to at some level the body. Mostly, I would say this, mostly it's an anxiety response to some sort of threat. So that person, when somebody's tapping their legs, or the legs are in a particular formation, like, you could have one foot might be in front of the other foot, and the other foot, one that's behind, is sort of arched upwards, and they're on their toes type thing. Used from a somatic experiencing perspective, we say that they're basically in a flight mode. Their sympathetic system's on, and part of them they want to flee. So they're perceiving it some sort of, even though they might be comfortable and they're coping with it, their body is still perceiving it as a flee response. So they're a bit more sympathetically aroused. So again, from an SE point of view, it's a bit repetitive, but if you are noticing that, again, you want your ventral vagal to come online a bit more. And so as you do some of that, try and do some breathing. I won't recommend, if you're a socializer, you won't recommend doing some sounds, but just some deep breaths type thing, or just even noticing that your legs. And one thing you could do is you can look around, surreptitiously or whatever, just look around. Or try and check in, say, I'm okay. Maybe, because sometimes these things happen are all conscious responses to, our history is playing out in the here and now. And so they could, another thing, if they're on a table in a social situation, they could just put their hands rather on their thighs and just, rub their thighs or squeeze their thighs and reassure. So it's that touch thing happening again. So they're bringing part of their attention to their legs and helping them, to help regulate their nervous system, that type of thing. Yeah. But sometimes just noticing can be enough for most people. But yeah.
Does that ever backfire and exacerbate the shaking if you bring your attention to it?
Good question. I guess it depends. Yeah, it depends how much anxiety is in the system. If they're really panicky, that yeah, it might exaggerate it a little bit. It could do, but yeah, I'm not really sure, really, to be honest. But if they were on a high anxiety, and that was happening in the therapy room, I'll be getting them to look around. The more anxious someone is, really looking around and engaging your environment to see that you're safe right now. Because the problem with the trauma, when I say problem, and high anxiety, it's the past that's being past memories or past beliefs or past experiences that are sort of manifesting, if you like, in the here and now. So their body thinks, and they think there's a threat in the system because that's what they're used to. But actually looking around sends the message, no, there is no threat here. I'm safe. It's okay. So it might not get rid of the anxiety completely or the distress, but all being well, it will tone it down and be more manageable.
Here's one on anger. People who feel really tense up or really angry when something doesn't go their way, or somebody's done something to kind of cross their boundaries a little bit, and they feel really tense in the shoulders, and they're kind of like hunching up, squeezing their hands, not wanting to cause a scene, but trying to hold that anger in. Or other people may just burst out and just attack, argue, and that sort of stuff. Do you have any insights into a somatic experiencing way of managing anger?
Yeah. Again, it's kind of like befriending it in a way. It's a difficult one in the sense, because in the here and now, if you're not used to regulating your anger, then there's more chance of acting out. So I think, generally speaking, if somebody's in that situation and they feel like they can't regulate their anger without acting out in some way, saying something they're going to regret later, or do something they're going to regret later, I think the best thing to do is leave. So you just move. You can just say, I'll come back in a while and we'll talk about it then, or whatever it is. If it's a relational situation, which most people can relate to, I suppose. That's the best way for if it's really too much to hold on to or to be with. If you're able to be with the anger and you're not going to act it out, then I would utilize it to be assertive, to say to the other person, if they've, as you said, if they've transgressed a boundary, they've said something inappropriate or offensive or whatever like that, then your anger's there to give you the energy to say, no, I don't really like what you said to me. I don't want you to say it to me again, please. I found that offensive, if that's what's needed. So sometimes voicing it, if they can, I'm saying, if they can, rather than if they know that that's too hard, and it just ends up in an argument, or they just end up in a situation they're going to regret later, then yeah, removing yourself and then coming back later when you're a bit more feeling a bit more under control.
Mm. Some people have a real difficulty voicing that assertiveness, which I see as within the context of anger. I think anger and assertiveness is a positive element of anger, and confidence in the same way activates the nervous system in a similar way. Whereas people have a really negative conception of anger because of how they were raised and what they've seen around. And anytime they got angry, it never served them in any positive way. So let's say they tried to voice their opinions and then they were shut down even more. But
Sure.
now it's not part of their day to day, although it may be in some workplace situations or that sort of stuff. In those contexts, people would tend to bottle or are more agreeable. How can they learn to voice that tension that's coming up for them?
Yeah, it's sort of, I guess that's, again, it's recognizing that nobody ever never says no type thing. So you can, on lots of levels, so say if I was working with somebody on that level, I would find examples when you were able to say no type thing. And then from a somatic, when you did say no to whatever situation it was, then you, from a somatic point of view, you go, well, how did you feel? How do you feel right now when you bring up that memory or of when you said no? So that's what in the therapy room I would do that. I'd also encourage in the therapy room around if the client wants to say no to me, I encourage them to say no to me. If I ask a question and you say this body you said wants to say no, then you support that kind of process. I think really though you want, on another level, you kind of wanting to sort of stimulate the anger in the person. In Gestalt, we call it retroflexion, where you have a feeling and you retroflect it back in. So you sort of, as you said, suppress it and hold it in. But that emotion's still there somewhere. And so it can, I mean, there's some research stuff now around how the link between anger and cancer and all this sort of stuff. So I think anger is for me, anger is the most misunderstood feeling in our culture. And it's most of the time it's given a really negative perception because for obvious reasons it gets acted out inappropriately, and it's just not, and people don't have good role models of how to be with their anger. In somatic experiencing, anger, there's natural aggression is healthy aggression. I think that's what they call it. Yeah, it's healthy aggression, which is completely appropriate, as you mentioned before, around setting boundaries, and is needed in certain contexts. It's not there for nothing. It's a feeling that's required in certain contexts, and so it's basically learning to practice and be with the feeling without feeling shame about it or guilt about it, or asserting oneself for those people that, as you say, have to hold it in because it's never been valued or wasn't supported and allowed to be as part of their repertoire of who they are. And it's always, I think, yeah, in situation, I can't think of anything sort of simple examples other than that, what I said, for people that are not interested in coming to therapy. It's a difficult one, really. I think if what's coming to mind now is they're just thinking of when they can be assertive, and if they wanted to be assertive. Is there certain situations when they allow themselves to be assertive and focus on that and be with that and see how that felt. And then sometimes you have to push your edge a little bit, and it's an experiment. Well, what's the next safest level for me to be able to express a no, or express or assert myself when I don't want to do something? That could be with a friend, a close friend who is not going to leave you because you've said no, type thing. So I think it's about doing it in safe way, practicing it in safe ways, in safe context first, and then learning to be and see what the impact of that is on you and how you respond to it, and then take it up a notch by pushing that edge and into another thing that has a little bit of anxiety about doing it, and then see what happens. That's what I'd be suggesting. Yeah, if they weren't coming to a counselling session, that's for sure. Yeah.
Rob, thank you so much for your generosity in your time and for kind of walking us through all these concepts from a body-based point of view, your experiences, what's led you and made you who you are today. And I just want to say, for those who wanted to learn a little bit more about you and want to find out a bit more information, or just refer to the things that you've been talking about today, where would you be able to point them?
Okay, so I've got a website. It's relatively new, but it's called threepillarscounselling.com. So you can find me there. There's more information there if they wanted to know more about it.
With the number 3 or with the...
Oh, okay, no, three as in letters, THREE, pillarscounselling.com. Yeah, it's all lowercase. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I'll recommend everybody visit Rob's website and find out more about Rob and who he is and the type of work that he does. So,
okay.
So much.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been fun. This is the first interview I've ever had. I'll definitely disclose that. So it was really fun, and I wasn't expecting it to go so long. So that's brilliant. Yeah, thank you.
You've made it really easy, Rob.
All right, thanks.